B1.
This lecture is Women and the History of Science. So it's going to be not only about how we see women, but also about different ways in which we can think about history itself and how we write history and tell stories about the past. And I'm going to start with my favourite quotation, I think, of all time. It's by a woman called Hertha Ayrton, who was a physicist at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And she wrote, "I do not agree with sex being brought into science at all. The idea of woman and science is completely irrelevant. Either a woman is a good scientist or she is not." And for me, that's a very ideologically sound statement, and it's what I'd like to believe our current state of science is. I'm not at all sure, I'm not at all convinced that that actually is true now, but I'm not going to be analysing the current state of science. I'm going to be looking at some women in the past and how the past has affected attitudes towards women today. Because for me, that's one of the main points of doing history. Of course, I'm interested in what did happen and sort of writing little stories about the past and doing detective hunts in the archives. But for me, the whole point of doing history is to understand more fully how we've arrived at our present situation and hopefully be able to do something in order to improve the future. So that's my sort of motivation for looking at women in the history of science. There certainly was discrimination against women in the past, whether there is or not now. And Hertha Ayrton herself is a good example. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, not just to do a biography of Hertha Ayrton, but to pick out some of the key features of her life that illustrate attitudes towards women in the past. And this is a picture of the chemistry laboratory at Girton. Girton was the first women's-only college at Cambridge, and it was founded in 1869, and Hertha Ayrton came here a few years later in 1876. But at that time, women still couldn't go to the laboratories of the major laboratories at the Cavendish belonging to Cambridge University. So the women's colleges had separate laboratories for the women. And Hertha Ayrton probably studied in this laboratory. Unsurprisingly, when centuries of tradition were overthrown and women first came to Cambridge, there was considerable opposition. And this is a rather satirical poem from Punch, the comic journal, very famous in the 19th century. "The woman of the future, she'll be deeply read, that's certain, with all the education gained at Newnham or at Girton." Newnham and Girton were the two women's colleges at Cambridge. "She'll puzzle men in algebra with horrible quadratics, dynamics and the mysteries of higher mathematics." So that's a rhyme which is of course, mocking the pretensions of women who want to learn subjects like mathematics and physics. I think it's also expressing a certain amount of fear and trepidation on the part of the men. I mean, it is quite true that some of the women were considerably better than them at maths, and this was a source of consternation to some of the men. But it articulates a belief that was prevalent then, and I think to some extent still is now. You can either be a normal woman or you can be a good scientist, but you can't possibly be both. And I'll go on and tell you a bit more about Hertha Ayrton. So she got a certificate of mathematics at Cambridge. Because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to graduate. And in fact, women couldn't graduate from Cambridge University until 1949. They couldn't officially get their bit of paper. And there's a picture on the right of her most famous book, The Electric Arc, which had very practical application. It was to stop street lights from stuttering at night. And in 1902, she was proposed for fellowship of the Royal Society, which is the year the book, The Electric Arc, was published. But although she was proposed for fellowship, she was turned down on the grounds, which might seem rather extraordinary now, that she was married. But in fact, at this time, neither teachers nor civil servants, if they were women, were allowed to be married. So this was the reason for her rejection from the Royal Society. At least she was allowed to read her own paper at the Royal Society. She was the first woman that was able to do that. And so I'm going to go back and talk a bit now about Mary Somerville. in a way, Hertha Ayrton's predecessor, although she didn't go to university, she couldn't go to university. And in 1826, she published a paper in the Philosophical Transactions, which is the official academic journal of the Royal Society. And the picture on the right there is a marble bust of Mary Somerville that was put in the foyer of the Royal Society. I always think it's rather a backhanded tribute because she was never allowed in the Royal Society, and when her paper was presented, her husband, who was a doctor, had to read it out for her, even though he knew very little about it. So in the course of this lecture, my basic question is going to be, how have women been perceived by historians of science? And until a few decades ago, they were largely ignored by historians of science. And since then, I think, roughly since about the 1960s and 70s, the rise of the feminist movement, there have been two major approaches towards thinking about women in the history of science. The first is to emphasize how much they were discriminated against. The second is to try and resurrect individual women as hidden heroines who've been concealed in the history. And the third version is the one that I would like to put forward, which I've called here deromanticising the past. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about each of these in turn.
B2. Extract 1.
This lecture is Women and the History of Science, so it's going to be not only about how we see women, but also about different ways in which we can think about history itself and how we write the history and tell stories about the past.
Extract 2.
But I'm not going to be analysing the current state of science. I'm going to be looking at some women in the past and how the past has affected attitudes towards women today.
Extract 3.
And so I'm going to go back and talk a bit now about Mary Somerville, in a way, Hertha Ayrton's predecessor, although she didn't go to university, she couldn't go to university.
Extract 4.
So in the course of this lecture, my basic question is going to be, how have women been perceived by historians of science?
Extract 5.
And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about each of these in turn.
B3.
But it articulates a belief that was prevalent then, and I think to some extent still is now. You can either be a normal woman, or you can be a good scientist, but you can't possibly be both.
B4.
Way of describing the past either. So the way that I personally would like to integrate women into the history of science is what I've called deromanticising the past. I'd like to set up more realistic role models for both the sexes. So rather than rewriting the traditional genius version of science and rewriting it for women, I think we should broaden what counts as the history of science. History of science is about far more than great instruments, great equations, great men. It's also about understanding how it is that a huge range of practical and theoretical information became known about and spread throughout the world. How is it that science has become so important in modern society? And when you consider the history of science from that point of view, you find out that women have a far greater role as communicators, illustrators, and educators. So I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to start with an example I've mentioned twice already, is the Herschels. So this is a picture on the left of the huge telescope that was erected in the house where Caroline and William Herschel lived. Caroline, as well as William, was involved in building this. It was her job to superintend the scores of workmen who were putting it together. When it was lying flat on the ground, she conducted visitors through the tube because you could crawl through. She was also physically involved. She was also very much involved in the measurements. This picture makes it very clear, I think, that if you're looking at the stars, you need at least two people. You need William, who was at the top of the telescope, and you need somebody else at the bottom to write down the reading and write down the time at which the measurement was taken. And this, of course, is, in fact, this picture should all be in the dark. So you have to imagine William and Caroline Herschel out there in the dark, in the snow, night after night. And William Herschel is shouting down the readings to Caroline, and she writes them in her notebook. And then the next day, she goes inside, takes all the readings, and carries out all sorts of mathematical calculations which transform raw data into information that can be incorporated into a catalogue. And she, not William, ended up publishing all the catalogues, which were the standard star catalogues and atlases, for several decades afterwards. So it seems to me that was a far more important contribution to science than the 8 comets that she just happened to discover. Minor comets aren't particularly significant. The fact that she discovered them a few days before somebody else doesn't seem particularly relevant to me. But the fact that she worked with her brother on this, collecting all this astronomical data, and that she was responsible for publishing it so that it could be used by other people. It seems to me that that is a far greater contribution to science, although it's something that we don't usually hear about.